Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Mike Bell, Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here at the National World War II Museum, and thank you for joining this session of our Memory Wars Conference. While the previous panel discussed events of Eastern Europe, this session will take a look at another area of the world that has many issues today that are often tied to the Second World War and the memory of it. The title of this one is War and Memory in China, and to lead this conversation with Dr. Rana Mitter, we'll have our very own Dr. Rob Citino with us. Many of you know Rob. Rob is the museum's Samuel Zemurray Stone Senior Historian here at the Institute. He's an award-winning military historian and scholar who's published 10 books, many focusing on the German Army. He's also published numerous articles covering the Second World War and the 20th century military affairs. Rob enjoys close ties with the U.S. military establishment. He taught a year at West Point and 2 years at the Army War College and was highly acclaimed there. In 2021, Rob won the Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize for the Society of Military History for lifetime achievement in the field. So we're incredibly pleased to have Rob, and Rob, take it away for this conversation.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's always a delight anytime I get to interact with Rana Mitter. Rana's done much programming for us here at the museum. He comes out with a new book with regularity. It wins awards. He's just a wonderful interviewer, a wonderful interviewee. I would say Rana is one of the world's leading authorities on the history of modern China. He's written A Bitter Revolution, China's Struggle with the Modern World. He wrote Forgotten Ally, which for my money is the best single book ever written on China in the Second World War. It's a complex tale, and Rana tells it in style. Most recently, and a book I've been looking at a lot lately, especially thinking about the memory conference here, China's Good War. You can see everybody gets a really nice look at that, which is how World War II is shaping a new nationalism. Rana's a professor at Oxford University and the director of their China Center there. So, Rana Mitter, welcome back to the museum, even if it's only, shall we say, onto our airways, but it's really good to have you again.
Rob, it's great to be back here. Thank you for that very generous welcome, and it's always such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Apart from saying that you've been too generous, I will say one thing to your wonderful audience. So great that you all come here today. I apologize in one level for the fact that you can see the background behind me is truly professorial, but I feel that if we were discussing auto repair and I had brought you into my garage, I wouldn't necessarily have cleaned up all the kind of oil and rags. So since this is where I write the books, I feel that essentially I'm showing you my garage, and I hope that that's not necessarily inauthentic in this case.
Rana, you're absolutely out of central casting with that backdrop, so I want to congratulate you on that. We have a big topic here, and what we normally do here at the museum, we'll run through maybe 35, 40 minutes of questions, and then hopefully have a lot of time for queries from the audience, because I'm certain there's going to be some. You know, you titled your 2020 book, Rana, China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. You open with a really great set piece, I would say, describing an enormous military parade in Beijing's Tiananmen Square on September 3rd, 2015. Tell us about this event. You refer to it, you describe it as kind of a signal event in the way that China views World War II. Why?
It is. And Rob, let me also, when I just say a brief word about that event, explain why I think it's such a signal event. So if you watched footage of this particular event, the VJ Day commemoration of 70 years since the surrender of the Japanese, the end of World War II in Asia, and you could find it on YouTube, or other channels are available. A lot of it would look very familiar from any Chinese parade, kind of guys in green uniform, lots of missiles and weaponry being shown, and of course Xi Jinping, president of China, there up on the reviewing stand. So that sounds very standard for the world's biggest communist country. But right in the middle of this particular commemoration, September 2015, something very unusual happened, which was essentially a small group of men was brought to the front to be presented to President Xi Jinping. And this group of men, who were in their 90s, and I think a couple were over 100 at that point, were veterans of World War II. Again, for the audience at this event, nothing unusual there. But what was very unusual is that half of them were from the old communist armies, which had fought against the Japanese between 1937 and 45, the years of that war in China. And the other half were from the old nationalist Kuomintang or Kuomintang, as you sometimes see it transliterated, armies of Chiang Kai-shek. Of course, the old enemy of the Chinese communists, but also the army that had been in the lead in terms of opposing Japan during those wartime years. And the fact that those veterans were finally being acknowledged, the non-communists as well as the communists, in front of the president of China, in front of the general secretary of the Communist Party of China, was a really important moment of transition in terms of China coming to terms not just with the communist role in World War II, but in China's role as a more unified actor against the Japanese during that period. And that's why that parade, for me, I think, was such a turning point, such an indicative moment in terms of understanding why China's relationship with World War II has been changing.
Rana, you labeled that event, and I'm quoting, the first national large-scale public commemoration of China's role in World War II. Living in the U.S., where we celebrate this war constantly, I might even say sometimes seem to over-celebrate it. I find that incredible. What factors kept China from remembering the war up to that point?
Well, Rob, you're talking to a Brit here. So if you're talking about countries that really want to hark back to, the finest hour, Winston Churchill is constantly invoked. And when, 2 years ago, when the pandemic hit the UK, Her Majesty the Queen gave, a public national address in which her very last words were, "We will meet again." In other words, a reference to Vera Lynn's famous wartime song, "We'll Meet Again." Still very much a cultural meme, a cultural moment for anyone growing up in the British tradition. So we do World War II as well. And the surprise often for Westerners is that so does China, but it does it in a different sort of a way. And you're right to point out that actually it's relatively recently, by which I mean, let's say only really since the 1980s, and in a big, big way, really since the beginning of the 21st century, our own century, that the Chinese have really taken World War II to heart and made it a very central part of the way that they think about their own culture. The reason it took so long is quite basic, and it's this. The reality of World War II in China was, first of all, that it was a devastating conflict, and you've been very, very kind, very generous in mentioning my own book on World War II in China. Happily or sadly, we don't have time to summarize the entire book here, but let me give you 3 sentences which explain why this event was such a transformative, traumatic one in Chinese history. Number 1. World War II in China, 1937 to 45, caused, depending on which stats you use, but directly attributable to the war itself, 8 million to 14 million deaths, including things like deaths like famine, not just all combat casualties, but horrific death during that time. Number 2, 80 million to 100 million Chinese became refugees within their own country during that time. And number 3, and by no means incidental, more than 500,000 Japanese troops were kind of held down in a quagmire by Chinese forces until Pearl Harbor, when the Americans and the British came along to join in as allies. So this was a really major event. But of course, China's leader during that time was the man I mentioned briefly before, Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader of China, who was a devout anti-communist and had been, basically trying to wipe out the fledgling Chinese communist movement in the 30s. They went on the famous or notorious Long March of the 1930s to get away from him. The arrival of the Japanese, the invasion, caused a brief truce between the two sides. They got together rather uneasy to fight against the Japanese. But the moment Japan was defeated, end of 1945, middle of 1945, a civil war breaks out very, very quickly. And eventually, as people will know, ends with the victory of the communists and Chairman Mao on the mainland, and Chiang Kai-shek flees to Taiwan, never to return to the mainland again. So that meant that for the next 30 or 40 years, all through Chairman Mao's period of rule, all through Richard Nixon's visit, 1972, all the way to the early 80s, it became politically incorrect, politically impossible to say anything very much positive about the Chiang Kai-shek nationalists and their contribution to the defeat of Japan during World War II in China. The communist role, which was significant, in fact, you could talk about that, but talking about what the people who had become the enemies of communist China, who were still hiding out on Taiwan, that wasn't something that people could talk about. And it took really till the 1980s. Mao had died, Chiang had died, and also the Cultural Revolution, horrific set of events in the 60s and 70s, had ended and really disillusioned the Chinese people with violent class struggle of the sort that Mao had promoted. So instead, a new patriotic unifying narrative was needed. And they realized that, as in Britain, as in the United States, actually as in Russia, World War II, that occasion when people came together from all parties and none and fought against an invader, might just be the right story to tell. And from that moment, from the 80s and 90s onwards, China began to rediscover and retell and broaden its own account of World War II, not just in the history books, not just in the academy, but on television, in movies, in popular culture, even video games. That's one of the big areas where you see the youth of today in China engaging with the war.
Just as here in the United States about the video games. So one of the stumbling blocks for China, maybe the stumbling block, was the fact that the China that fought the war, the nationalist China, the KMT, is not the China of today, a people's republic, and which is, of course, still a dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party. We focus in on Jiang for a moment. Within Chinese discourse, what were you allowed to say about Chiang Kai-shek and the People's Republic of the 50s and 60s? Here was the generalissimo who had led China's armies, the president, perhaps the dictator of the world's most populous nation. He sort of disappeared from Chinese histories of World War II during that period.
Essentially, the only thing you could say about Chiang Kai-shek, and you couldn't say very much during the era of Chairman Mao, was that he was basically a coward and a fool and someone who had essentially fled to the interior of China and basically done almost nothing while the communists did all the fighting. This wasn't historically accurate. I mean, any historian today would say that the nationalists, the Kuomintang, played the major role, but the communists played a very important secondary role in terms of guerrilla warfare and also making sure that the Japanese were harried and harassed, so the communists weren't irrelevant. But any story which didn't include the Kuomintang, the nationalists, really wasn't going to be complete at that time. But that version of history, that version of Chiang Kai-shek's contribution, has been really very significantly altered by the way in which history has changed, or the reading of history has changed in China from the 1980s to the present day. What I mean, to give an example to illustrate that, is this. If you go, for instance, to Huangshan, which is a very nice little kind of village, essentially, just outside Chongqing, the wartime capital of China, known in the West at the time as Chungking. This was where Chiang Kai-shek had his headquarters. It was out of the range of Japanese air raids. It was a little fresher, a little more leafy as a place to have your headquarters. So that little hillside house has been rehabilitated, and you can find statues of Chiang Kai-shek there. You can find his old wartime desk, his telephone, all of the equipment he used to actually make plans, preserved in a very respectful way. It's not done in mockery. It's not done in any kind of negative way. It basically portrays him as the man who was commanding China at that particular time. And that is to do with the fact that the rehabilitation of that period has been deemed necessary by the party to bring into public understanding this wider story of World War II as a transformative, unifying experience for China. But essentially, it wasn't possible to do that without bringing in the parts of the country, like the Southwest, where Chiang Kai-shek had actually been powerful in the old days, and allowing them to rehabilitate some of their own story in a very different sort of way. It's a little like the way in the United States that different parts of the country have their own legends, the legend of the Far West, the story of the Deep South, all of these sorts of things have their own regional stories, but they all combine together in a national story, which isn't always coherent, but certainly has a particular trajectory of its own. And Chiang Kai-shek, in that sense, fits into that sort of story, Rob, because it's still the case that he's regarded as the man who was the enemy who Mao had to defeat to create the communist state. But he's also regarded as a man who made a significant contribution to defeating the Japanese in the war. And today's People's Republic of China is somehow able to hold both of those stories in its mind at the same time.
They say that's the hallmark of a brilliant mind, is being able to think of two diametrically opposed ideas that are as both being true simultaneously, Rana. So Chiang Kai-shek, you say he's being rehabilitated, the term we use when a communist or authoritarian state suddenly allows someone sort of back into the pantheon. The appearance of his diaries seems to have been played an important role there. I believe in the 1990s of enormous interest in China and elsewhere. But are there still limits to how far one can go in, shall we say, discussing Jiang openly?
Yes, it's the very short answer to your question, but let me give a slightly longer one. I will first of all say that when we're talking about the wider significance of Chiang Kai-shek and his role in the shaping of modern Chinese history, you do have there someone who is now regarded as a significant shaper of the 20th century. And he is someone who is regarded as having led a government which was deeply flawed in terms of corruption, backwardness, and so forth, but also took some tentative steps towards modernization. This is aside from the World War II role. We're thinking about things like the building of railways in the 1920s and 30s, and some of the attempts to regain China's sovereignty in a wider sense. In other words, the sense that this is something that, for instance, the right of China to charge its own tariffs on imports sounds like a very dry subject, but it was a subject of huge controversy in the early 20th century. And in the 1930s, Chiang Kai-shek's government was very active in getting China a restoration of those particular rights. So those sorts of stories can still be told. But overall, let's be, frank about it. In the last 2-3 years, there's been a bit of a pushback in China on some of these issues. Essentially, Xi Jinping, as part of his project of recasting China as a more nationalist state, as a state that is less tolerant of dissent than it was even a few years ago, has suggested that there is a crime that is called historical nihilism. And, this sounds rather a philosophical, if slightly chilling sort of concept. What he means by philosophical nihilism is historical nihilism is basically telling versions of history that don't fit with the overall narrative of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, various of the things I've talked about don't necessarily cut directly across that requirement. So saying that Chiang Kai-shek had a significant role in winning World War II, for China, that's sort of okay as long as you don't make the guy into too much of a hero. But other elements, such as Chiang Kai-shek's role in the Civil War of 1946 to 49 and the legitimacy of the Chinese communists in having won that civil war, that's the kind of area that can't be talked about in too nuanced or complex a way, because it might chip away that overall narrative of the inevitable victory of communism in China. So I'd say that you have to be more careful than you did even a few years ago in China about which bits of modern history you take out and where you choose to run against the grain of what the party is happy to allow to be discussed.
Well, Rana, count me in as a historical nihilist. I want myself in that. That's a club I would like to join. About the war itself, I spend much of my own time as a researcher and writer thinking about military operations and writing about military operations. So if there was one dominant trope of the historiography when I was a young graduate student, for example, many, many years ago now, it was that the nationalist armies were hopeless. They were badly trained. They were under-equipped, largely because Zhang and his cronies were siphoning off aid money that was supposed to go to buy weapons. They were liable to run away when things got tough. We know today that none of these things is true, don't we? I mean, what sorts of discussions are you allowed to have about Zhang's armies in China today?
Absolutely. So let me say there has been really immense revisionism on the role and capabilities of the nationalist Kuomintang armies in the last 20, 25 years in China, and then amongst Western scholars who look at this. And although there are various people I could name, perhaps I could just give a shout out to one, Professor Hans van der Ven of Cambridge University here in England, who has written a book called War and Nationalism in China, which was it was the first major English language revision, which drew on Chinese sources, but very much put forward that argument about the nationalist armies needing to be reassessed and rehabilitated. The book, I should say, at least in part, and I'm sure that Hans wouldn't mind me saying this, it's very much the case, is a book that pushes back against a man who for a long time was a great American hero, General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, the American chief of staff of Chiang Kai-shek's troops during World War II, and Hans van der Ven takes a rather less positive view of Stilwell than perhaps Barbara Tuchman did in her classic book of the 70s about the duel between Stilwell and Chiang Kai-shek. But getting to the subject of the armies, I think on the one hand, some of the accusations clearly had a great deal to them. So, for instance, the fact that the armies were under-equipped, that was certainly true. By the time the Americans came in sort of full scale after Pearl Harbor in early 1942, China had already been fighting on its own, including both the communists and the nationalists, for about 4.5 years. And this meant that, of course, many of the best trained troops that there had been killed or otherwise put out of commission. The supplies of weapons, always in some ways rather kind of exiguous, had found themselves really kind of run down to the bare minimum. I mean, again, we found ourselves in a very, very different way, but since we're in this global crisis right now, thinking about what the Ukrainians can get and what they can't, and that same argument of, we're all very sorry for China being invaded by Japan, but if the rest of us get actively involved, then we're going to be pulled in. Now, that may be accurate on this occasion. There were no nuclear weapons at that time, so I don't want to make an exact comparison by any means between Ukraine and China. But Chiang Kai-shek certainly felt very similar to Zelensky, which was that he felt that he wasn't being given the equipment that he needed to actually push back in the way that he wanted to do. In the early years of the war, conscription, which became one of the kind of hallmarks of why the Chinese armies were criticized, was not so much of a factor. There was more of a kind of recruitment mechanism that was actually quite successful. It gave local communities a chance to choose in various places who would go to the front and who wouldn't. But as the troops began to die off in large numbers, to be killed, this meant that the state found itself squeezing more and more to try and get more taxes from the peasantry, to get more recruits from the wider population, and generally squeeze the machine of the state to try and basically keep the war machine going, which they did, but at terrible cost. So I think finally on that, Rob, I would say that not all the accusations by any means, black marketeering, corruption, bad training, undermanning, all of these sorts of desertion, not all of these were inaccurate by any means, and some of them were absolutely the case literally. But the overall causation of understanding what it was to be a very poor agrarian state whose center of gravity had to move at great speed from eastern China to southwestern China, and then hole up for years and years without knowing when the war was going to end. These were circumstances in which almost no government could have really run things in ways that would have been to the satisfaction of much better funded and much more easily defended wartime belligerents, such as the United States, most obviously, but to some extent the British Empire and perhaps a little less the Soviet Union, which of course was included, but had more resources to play with than the Chinese did.
Let me flip that one over then on you, Rana. We talked about the KMT, the nationalist forces. Once again, from my own experience, back in the day, as we say here in the United States, we used to hear that the communists were the only force in China actually fighting the Japanese. Mao was the hero, the man of the hour. I well remember the first time I read Edgar Snow's Red Star Over China, a very popular book in the West that told that communist story or mythology, we might say con brio. We now know this to be a myth, do we not? Is it possible today to write a book in China that reduces the communist role in the anti-Japanese struggle?
It's possible to write such books, but the likelihood that they will be published uncensored, I think, is fairly limited. One of the red lines, and I use the term advisedly, that's still there is that a direct attack on the communist war effort is something that isn't going to be published in that form. But I think it's fair to say, Rob, that we can make an assessment now, and we should make an assessment of what is fair and what is not fair to say about the communist contribution to the anti-Japanese war. Because on the one hand, it would be too easy, I think, to say, look, these guys did nothing. They basically created this myth around themselves, and Edgar Snow was pushing propaganda, and the communists themselves really had no significant role whatsoever. And that's unfair as well. What actually I think it is fair to say is the following. In terms of these set-piece battles, big battles like Shanghai, 1937, Taizhuang, 1938, Changsha, actually many battles were fought there, but 1941 is one typical year. These are battles fought by nationalist troops against the Japanese, Kuomintang troops. The communists are not, in any meaningful sense, involved in them. The only set-piece campaign that is really, kind of a set of battles in the sense in which that term is usually understood by strategists, is the 100 Regiments campaign of 1941, where actually the leading communist general was Peng Dehuai, who would draw on that experience to essentially help to form what became the tactics of the Chinese Civil War in the post-World War II period. However, I think it is also fair to say that what the communists did do was to take their base areas and actually launch a very, very significant proportion of the guerrilla warfare that kept the Japanese harassed, hassled, in a situation where eventually they found themselves putting forward the rather terrifyingly named 3 alls policy, which stands for burn all, loot all, kill all. In other words, this huge kind of scorched earth strategy in large parts of central China that was stimulated essentially by the success of the partisan tactics of the communists in those particular places. Now, that sort of guerrilla tactics, which, by the way, the nationalists used in certain cases as well, but those particular tactics were very effective. But you have to understand what they're effective for. And one of the best places to look is a classic essay from 1938 by Mao himself on protracted war. I remember actually being in a kind of Chinese war college a few years ago and asking one of the officers there if anything that Mao wrote, 50, 70 years later was still of relevance. And he immediately said, yeah, 1938 on protracted war. That essay is still a kind of, if folks here are still reading Clausewitz or whatever it might be, well, reading Mao on protracted war is really a very important part of the Chinese training. And the reason is that it puts forward those tactics about how you can basically take advantage of your enemy's weaknesses. You're almost certainly not going to defeat the enemy that way, but you're going to make sure that they never have a moment to rest, that they can basically keep an insurgency going until. And both the communists and the nationalists were aware of this at the time, until you can bring in strong overseas assistance. And Chiang Kai-shek and the communists, were divided about whether it should be the Soviets or whether it should be the British or whether it should be the Americans or whether it should be all of them. But they were aware that their own particular tactics, set-piece battles by the nationalists, guerrilla warfare by the communists, had to work together as a means of holding the Japanese down until foreign intervention would finally create a situation where the war could be won. So in that sense, the fairest thing, I think, is to see the communists as genuine resistors, but ones who were part of a spectrum which included everyone from the American and the British foreign presence to, of course, the very important presence of the Kuomintang, the nationalists, which we mentioned before. They're part of that spectrum. They're not the only element in it. They're not even necessarily always the dominant element in it, but they're not negligible either.
Clausewitz tells us war is the domain of complexity, and what you're describing is an extremely complex operational environment, I guess I would say. On the diplomatic front, Rana, you have a particularly fascinating segment in the book on the 1943 Cairo Conference, which I think it's safe to say here in the United States does not really get the play of Potsdam or Tehran or the Arcadia Conference early in the war between Roosevelt and Churchill. But this was a big wartime moment for China, the only time, and again, quoting Dr. Mitter here, in which China was treated as an equal allied power with the U.S. and Britain. When I read that, I say, well, that's just the sort of thing the Chinese probably have been celebrating for the last 70 years. But for decades, they didn't celebrate it. And frankly, they really couldn't celebrate it, or you couldn't as a writer. Why? Well, you say there was an unfortunate fact, of course, at the Cairo conference. What was the unfortunate fact?
Well, that's right. Essentially, the best way I can explain what the unfortunate fact is by referring to a motion picture that came out in China in the year 2015. And it is a movie based on, fictionalized version of the goings-on at the Cairo conference that you mentioned there, Rob, of 1943. And as you said, one of the Allied leaders' conferences, but the only one, the only one that had Chiang Kai-shek in it. Obviously Churchill and Roosevelt got together frequently, Truman eventually as well, Stalin attended many, but in this particular case, the only one where China was represented. So this event was made into a kind of blockbuster movie in 2015, and the poster for the movie received a certain amount of really significant mockery on the Chinese internet. The reason being that the movie poster had Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, right in the center of it, and Chiang Kai-shek, who had been at the conference, absolutely nowhere. And eventually the poster had to be revised because this is ridiculous. But the reason for this was, of course, that the makers of the film thought it was kind of politically problematic to point out that the leader of China, the first one to sit in, as I said, that equal standing with the Prime Minister of the British Empire, Winston Churchill, and the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist, the great enemy of the people who eventually was chased to Taiwan. And even in 2015, bringing that up too explicitly, at least in the publicity, was felt to be a bit sensitive. That, of course, is the reason for the wider phenomenon that you mentioned in your question, Rob, which is, why doesn't this get mentioned before and why is it being mentioned now? Well, It isn't mentioned very much during the whole Cold War period, all the way from the let's say 1940s up to the 1980s or 90s, because of that fact that the kind of taking to China of a global on a global level, which is essentially one of the symbolic meanings of Chiang being there with Churchill and Roosevelt in Cairo in 1943, but that happened under a nationalist leader. So essentially, that's because Mao, doesn't want anyone to think of Chiang as a positive figure in terms of World War II. But there's another much more pragmatic reason why this war suddenly comes back. And we saw that in 2013, it's 9 years ago, on the 70th anniversary of the Cairo Conference. And I will flag up that we may see this again next year, 2023, which will be the 80th anniversary. So what did we see? So a lot of mention in Chinese media, Chinese propaganda of this Cairo conference. And a lot of Westerners looking at this like, what are these guys talking about? This obscure, wartime conference. Why on earth are they bringing it up? And the reason is that at the end of the conference, as happened with other Allied conferences, as you know much better than I do, is that a communique was issued, a statement of what had been decided. Most of the strategic decisions that were made at Cairo were not all that significant in the end, partly because when Roosevelt and Churchill met Stalin at Tehran shortly afterwards, Stalin basically kind of forced them to reverse most of what they promised to Chiang Kai-shek. So the strategy is not the major reason that it was important. The importance lies in this communique set out at the end, the Cairo Declaration, which says, amongst other things, in slightly ambiguous language, that when the war's over, islands that have been seized by Japan, apart from the main islands of Japan, are going to go back to various types of sovereignty, including to the Republic of China. And ever since then, China, the People's Republic of China, has used the Cairo Declaration as a means of arguing that the Diaoyu Islands in particular, or the Senkaku Islands as they're known in Japanese, they sit halfway between China and Japan in the East China Sea, that the sovereignty for those islands should be China's. Now, they're currently controlled by Japan, and the United States has always been a little bit, how can I put it, cagey about acknowledging any sovereignty claim. It says it's for international law to sort out. But the Chinese have been absolutely, clear that they want to use the precedent of that Cairo Declaration from 1943, signed off by Chiang Kai-shek, by Winston Churchill, and by Franklin D. Roosevelt, to argue that they should have these islands. And if you step back for a moment, this is a fantastic piece of chutzpah, to use a fine old Chinese classical Chinese term, because essentially the Chinese Communist Party of today in Beijing is trying to cash a check that was written originally by Chiang Kai-shek back in 1943, and arguing that that Republic of China state that he ran, which they ran off the mainland and claimed was illegitimate, nonetheless had enough public standing at that time that today's Beijing, in a very different world, should be able to use it as a precedent for its claims in the 2020s. So this isn't just history, this is very much current affairs.
I do like the use of the word chutzpah. I'm also impressed that there is actually a blockbuster film in 2015 on the Cairo conference. If it's ever dubbed into English, I'll be first in line to see it. So this is history, sort of using history in the service of a present day concern, Rana. China emerged from World War II and the Civil War, I don't know, a wreck, I suppose is the best way to put it. But today, the People's Republic, appears as a wealthy and powerful, confident, great power, a player on the international stage. And it's using its influence to promote a new view of China's wartime struggle. If you don't mind, let me give an experience I had recently. A couple of years ago, I saw the new film Midway, directed by Roland Emmerich. In the middle of the film, there was what I could only consider a kind of a non sequitur. U.S. pilots from the Doolittle raid, they parachute into China or crash land in China. And there's a very vivid scene depicting a Japanese air raid on a helpless Chinese village. It has almost nothing to do with the rest of the plot of the film. I was puzzled. And I found out the film was made possible by Chinese financing. At least a Hong Kong-based company had put up about half of the total budget. I'm not suggesting anything sinister here. Long live capitalism. You can sell the movie, by all means do so. But is the Chinese government using cinema today to make a point about World War II to the global community?
It absolutely is, Rob. It absolutely is. So that particular entrance point into the Midway movie of the Doolittle Raid? Well, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, one is actually, I mean, you know that actually the Doolittle Raid was an important event in the early part of the Asian War, and therefore actually a movie alerting audiences to it is as long as it's historically reasonably accurate, I mean, no necessarily bad thing. I think it also marks the fact that, for good or ill, the Chinese market for movies is now considered to be very important by Hollywood, and we know that in some cases, perhaps inappropriately, in other cases perfectly appropriately, plots have been changed to try and reflect the fact that China was a player in all sorts of events, and certainly World War II is made part of that. So that may have more to do, as you say, with kind of capitalism and the way in which Hollywood tries to increase its markets. But what's the wider agenda? Well, I would say that actually, despite that appearance of the Doolittle Raid in the war in that particular film, China actually has not been fantastically successful in terms of telling its own wartime story to the wider world. There have been a certain number of films that deal with wartime issues, such as the horrific case of the massacre of Nanjing in 1937-38, when the Chinese capital city was taken by the Japanese, and many, many thousands of people were killed. Sexual assault on many thousands of women in the city. The whole thing became known famously as so-called the Rape of Nanking because of the extent and horror of what went on at that time. There have been some movies about that have had a certain amount of box office in the Western world, but the honest truth is that they're a bit clunky. And I think if I give just one more example that happened very recently of why I think this hasn't taken off, it may explain some of the problems. So this is a movie that I thought was pretty interesting. I saw it, but which got a relatively limited distribution in the Western world. That was a movie called The 800. It came out in 2020. A fated year, as we know. And I think it may have been the single biggest grossing movie in the world in 2020 for the simple reason that very few places had their movie theaters, their cinemas open in that summer of the pandemic. But China did, because, of course, it was sort of closing itself off. And so this movie made $300 million at the Chinese box office, made by a big director, Guan. And, it basically tells the tale of a regiment of soldiers in China who fight against the Japanese during the Battle of Shanghai in 1937. And this film ran into two sets of problems, but they were quite distinct problems. The problem it ran into in China was the previous year it was supposed to have been released, and then it was banned at the last minute and held over for a year. The basic reason being that, as we were discussing earlier, it portrays nationalist Kuomintang soldiers in Shanghai, not communists. And there were quite a lot of people who thought this was not appropriate politically. It took a while for the film to come out of censorship and back into distribution, where, as I say, it was then a big commercial hit in China. So they sent it overseas, thought, well, let's, get it on the circuit in the US and Britain and elsewhere, particularly as the pandemic was beginning to ease. And it did very, very little box office. And the reason, I think, there are a lot of reasons, but one is that the central element that made it interesting, the question of why China would allow a big blockbuster movie that celebrated the role of the nationalists, the Chiang Kai-shek forces, is a tremendously interesting question if you are looking from the Chinese point of view. But it's not a question on which the rest of the world really these days feels it has any purchase whatsoever. And all it looked like to many people was a very big, bombastic wartime movie with lots of explosions, but this rather incomprehensible plot. I think unless we have, as I know the National Museum of World War II has been doing a brilliant job of doing, Rob, with its Road to Tokyo exhibition, unless we do a better job of educating the wider Western world about the Chinese role in World War II, it'll be harder to do that. And one other place I'd mention, your kind of sister museum, you might say, here in the UK, the Imperial War Museum in London, has just opened some fantastic new World War II galleries, which do also include new elements on China. But I think that story still has quite a long way to run before Western audiences will go and see movies that enable it to fit into a wider narrative. That is still, in my opinion, work in progress.
Certainly in my 3 decades of being an undergraduate educator, it's the great unknown aspect of World War II, still here in the United States. We chip away at it. Books like yours, Rana, do a great deal in terms of public education here in the States as well. And I helped you purchase some of those books behind you by the royalties you've been getting off books I've been selling in my classes over the last few years. So it's really an important story, and a lot more needs to be done. We have time for one more question, and I wish we had time for 30 more questions, but let me ask you a kind of, if we can broaden this from memory into the sort of realm of foreign policy for a moment. You touched on the Senkaku Islands earlier. How do you judge prospects for long-term relations between, let us say, the People's Republic and Japan? Isn't that going to be difficult to establish anything approaching stability with the Chinese today seemingly determined to refight World War II every minute of the day? I'm slightly exaggerating. Recently UNESCO had a memory of the World Archive, and the Chinese have 4,000 or 5,000 years of history, from the Zhou to the Manchu dynasty and then the PRC. And the wealth of materials that could have registered there, and it chose to register documents about the Nanjing massacre, something you talk about in your own book. I'm just curious if in the last couple of minutes we have for direct questioning, you can give us some insight into the future prospects for peace and stability in East Asia.
Sure. I mean, Rob, this is one of the kind of really sort of $64,000 questions. And even though, of course, we've all got our eyes on the horrific Russian war, the invasion of Ukraine, and that will be with us for some time to come, I hope less time than might be the case, considering the astonishing pushback by the Ukrainian resistance. But the East Asian sphere is still going to be a matter of great concern for years and years to come. The short answer to your very good question is that I think that although the legacy of the war will continue to make the relationship between China and Japan quite chilly in certain ways, because there is really no shared ground between the two, I think that nonetheless the geopolitics of other areas, including economics, will continue to mean that for the most part the two will have to interact. I mean, major Japanese manufacturing companies, there's Panasonics and Hitachis of this world, have big manufacturing plants in China. I don't see them moving them out. I will say that the question that could shift that dial, and it's one that we're all going to have to keep a very, very close eye on throughout this decade, is Taiwan. Much of the Taiwan discussion, and I'm sure folks on this call, on this conference, the kind of people who keep an eye on the news, you'll be aware that it's a big deal in Washington, D.C. I can assure you it's a big deal in Europe too. What's often forgotten from the Western Hemisphere is that it's a very big deal for the Japanese. The Japanese have, the ruling elite in Japan have, I suspect, kind of behind the scenes, given former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who stepped down a little while ago, authorization, you might say, to say in the public sphere, in the news in Japan, that Japan will consider any kind of attempt to end the autonomy of Taiwan as being a very hostile move. And this is a reminder, I think, to China, without spelling it out, that Japan has, depending how you count it, the 8th or 9th biggest defense spending in the world, about $44 billion a year. But of course, this is an effort that is based on the idea that the existing order in Asia must be preserved. China's going to have a role there. There's no way a power of that size could be excluded. But Japan is also very keen to make it clear that the status quo that exists and the rules-based order should not be pushed back against. So I think that looking forward to what you might call the unfinished business of the late Cold War, the Taiwan question, may become more central in minds of foreign policymakers in Asia, even than the continuing, in some ways rather sour legacy of the World War II period, which will continue also to shape that discourse.
Rana Mitter, thanks so much for those erudite answers. We've covered a lot of ground. The current book, Rana's current book, is China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. And it covers all this and a great deal more in classic fashion. At this point, I think we turn you over to the tender mercies of our audience for a question and answer, Rana. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rob, for your great questions as ever. I'm really looking forward to speaking to this wonderful audience.
Well, I just want to say, what an amazing session that was, Rob and Rana. Incredible insights. And now we'll turn to the audience, but that's a tour de force. So the first one is about memorials. What are the most well-known memorials to the Second World War in China? You could kind of describe those.
Absolutely, Kevin. Thank you for that great question. Well, there are so many that obviously time forbids me from going through them all, but let me just give you very quickly a couple of the ones that I would recommend because they deal with different sorts of aspects. In terms of the overall story of the war, I would go to the Museum of what in Chinese terms is called the War of Japanese Aggression, War of Resistance Against Japanese Aggression, which is their name for the sort of the China sphere of World War II. That's at the Marco Polo Bridge, which you may know is the site where the war actually broke out near Beijing in 1937. And there's now a whole really very comprehensive museum covering the communist side, the nationalist side, really quite even-handed in certain ways, actually, that exists on that site. Two other quick things I'd mention, though, in different parts of China. You know, that one I've just mentioned is kind of the overview. Go down to Chongqing, the old wartime capital, Chungking, as I mentioned, it used to be known, and see, you know, a horrific but necessary site, which is the memorial to the bombing, the air raid that in 1941 smashed a Japanese air raid that smashed an air raid shelter in central Chongqing and led to the death and suffocation of, you know, over 1,000 people in that particular place. And there's sculptures and other elements of the era that remind one of the story that it in some ways is a parallel with London, where one of the underground stations where people were sheltering was bombed in I think 1943, and you know killed a lot of people that way. Something similar happening with an air raid shelter in Chongqing. The final one, something that is probably quite familiar to this audience, but not necessarily perhaps in this form, which is the Burma campaign, the second Burma campaign, 1944. People tend to remember General Slim. They tend to remember Merrill's Marauders. They tend to remember the British, American, Australian, Indian even troops who fought against Japan. They sometimes forget that the Chinese were there too. And actually the Chinese have rediscovered that history, and down on the Burma border, places like Tangchung and others, there are these astonishing open-air memorials with a little like the famous terracotta army in Xi'an, but basically with 1930s nationalist soldiers reproduced as statues in a field, and a small, locally, but very interesting, locally produced museum containing artifacts, you know, helmets, uniforms, and so forth, from the Chinese contribution to the Burma Expeditionary Force in 1944. So those are just three of a whole range of astonishing memorials that are open to the public and very, very viewable in China once the COVID pandemic actually allows visitors to get back into China, which may not be just yet.
Oh, excellent.
You know, Rana, about Chongqing, this is a city that's kind of been transformed, has it not, by this sort of new memory revival? The very fact of building memorials in Chongqing, the central government in Beijing is permitting it, and of course that's directly linked with Zhang's regime.
That's exactly right, Robin. Just to make that point, which you made so well really clearly, a generation ago, 25, 30 years ago, it would have been pretty much unthinkable that the central communist authorities in Beijing would have allowed the old nationalist wartime capital to not just commemorate, but frankly celebrate the fact that during those years it was the headquarters of the nationalist government, very strongly anti-communist, but nonetheless anti-Japanese nationalist government of that time. Now that is a central part of the city's identity, and that is an example of how sometimes for this wider kind of nationalistic purpose, some awkward stories are allowed to slip past the central authorities because they help to boost a sense of regional pride, which then builds back into that wider sense of what it means to be Chinese. So Chinese propaganda and censorship is all-encompassing, but one thing that is worth noting is that it's often more subtle or more nuanced than people realize, and that rehabilitation of the nationalists in Chongqing and their wartime record is part of that relative nuance.
That's important insight. Let's switch to the role of women and the views. How does the Chinese government and popular culture remember women veterans from the Second World War? And then related to that, how do they depict Chiang's wife?
So really important questions both. In terms of women veterans of World War II, there's much more coverage of that than there was previously, where frankly, you know, gendered histories have not been a big part of the way in which China thought about its wartime history until recently. But one of the areas where there has been a great deal of concentration on it, for instance, is in Yan'an, the northwestern city where much of the communist movement was based during that time. It was Mao Zedong's base area. And the history essentially of women who come to that city, to Yan'an, as a revolutionary base, and the way in which they both contribute to the war effort, but also beyond that, find themselves actually having to kind of learn new revolutionary techniques and become part of the movement, is a really, really important and central part of the way in which they came to think about that. We can say, I'm going to give you one quick example of the kind of thing we're talking about. I've been recently reading and really finding interesting a wartime diary by a young woman, only in her 20s, who's part of a sort of entertainment troupe that the People's Liberation Army, or at that point the kind of Eighth Route Army, puts together to try and keep troop morale up. So these are not women fighting in the front lines in combat, but they're very much in the line of fire, and they're part of that wider movement of getting people to associate war with revolutionary change on the part of the communists. So that's something about one particular group of women. There are of course others. Let me flip the political switch the other way back to the nationalists and the Kuomintang, and say something about Chiang Kai-shek's wife, Sung Mei-ling, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, as she was known in the West. I'm going to make quite a big statement. Very happy for Rob or others to push back, but I think this is worth saying. Madame Chiang Kai-shek was an extraordinary character. She studied at Wellesley College in the United States, fluent, if somewhat kind of ornate English that she spoke, and she was essentially China's voice to the world during World War II. Had she not gone and sort of lobbied the US Congress in 1943, it may not have been possible for the big wartime loans that were then released to China perhaps to have come as freely or as easily. And because she had views of her own, and because she was very much someone who was sent as a representative of the Chinese government, I think she's one of maybe only two women in the first half of the 20th century who has a direct international influence in politics. The other one I'm thinking of is Eleanor Roosevelt. But she and Sung Mei-ling, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, are amongst the very few people I can think of, women who actually have that genuine direct international influence in politics at that time. Not to say there aren't other women, Madame Curie and so forth, who have a wider role, but in terms of politics, it's relatively rare, and those are two examples. Today, Sung Mei-ling is remembered quite respectfully in China itself, perhaps in some ways more than Taiwan, where that Chiang Kai-shek legacy actually has faded in various ways. But in my mind, there is no doubt that if you did not have the fluent English-speaking, media-savvy presence of Madame Chiang Kai-shek, of Sung Mei-ling, then China's war effort would have been seriously disadvantaged in the eyes of the United States, and China desperately needed the United States to stay in the war.
That's a great insight.
I won't push back on that, Rana, but I will say here in the States, Madame Zhang's reputation has waxed and waned. I remember in the 80s, Sterling Seagrave wrote a book called The Sung Sisters, which was about Madame Zhang, and her entire family, actually, the entire Sung clan, that was quite critical. And since then, there's been a number of revisions there. And so her reputation is in flux. When you say one of the two women to really have international impact at the time, I would completely agree with that. And that puts Madame Zhang in very august company indeed, and somebody I think we should maybe take a little closer look at than we have been.
Yeah, that's an important
Thanks,
insight.
Rob. Yep, would agree. Would agree.
So in this question, we're going to shift to the American Volunteer Group and how are Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers remembered in China?
Well, wonderful question. And again, I'm sure in this audience everyone knows, but just a reminder that the AVG, the American Volunteer Group, basically brought in, with tacit agreement from Roosevelt's administration, but obviously no public endorsement because they didn't want to get involved as neutrals in a war in China, but essentially one of the ways in which the bigger powers tried to provide some assistance from behind the scenes to Chiang Kai-shek to keep him going when the Japanese had invaded. And again, I don't want to kind of overstress the Ukraine comparisons, but I just throw that out there. Okay, how are they remembered? So for a very long time during the Cold War era, they weren't remembered at all because the idea that Americans had had anything to do with defending China during the wartime era was just not something that Mao wished to talk about in any kind of significant way. However, it is fair to say that from the reform era onwards, with the emergence of a much stronger, a much more broad sense of wanting to re-engage with the world, it became more amenable to, or at least the regime became more amenable to actually remembering in a very positive way the contribution of the American veterans, certainly the Flying Tigers, but also the wider American military presence in wartime China after 1941. The particular figure through whom the Flying Tigers memory was sort of rehabilitated is one who, again, maybe remembered certainly by Catholic Rob and others, but more broadly, and that was the wife of, or then widow of, General Claire Lee Chennault, who of course led the Flying Tigers, Anna Chennault, Chen Xiangmei, Chen Xiangmei in Chinese. She didn't actually marry him until after the war, and she was much younger than he was, so she lived much longer. But well into the 1990s and beyond, she was visiting China quite regularly, bringing often American, I think, veterans with her, as a sort of intermediary for this. And the reason this was a bit strange, but also interesting in terms of changing narratives, is that, again, those with longer memories will remember that Anna Chennault had been a really big figure in the so-called China lobby, the group that was in favor of keeping recognition of Taiwan all the way through the 50s and 60s until Richard Nixon eventually switched the attention to Beijing. And since she had danced with him, I think, at the 1968 Republican convention, she felt rather let down by the fact that he then turned to Mao and Zhou Enlai instead. But it's a sign that, nothing lasts forever, that even though Anna Chennault and the China lobby had felt very, angry in the 1970s and 80s, by the time you get to the decade after that, they had sort of all made up. And in fact, she was now being regarded and feted as a friend of China, as a sort of Chinese herself who had been close to this important moment of salvation for China in World War II. And she became this pivotal figure for many years in terms of bringing Flying Tiger veterans, in terms of bringing the Flying Tiger's story back to China. And you can certainly find plenty of memorials even now in parts of China which commemorate it in a very positive style and as a significant contribution that the United States made to the ultimate Chinese defeat of Japan.
And this next question, we're going to shift back to Nanking. Can you briefly discuss the role of John Robb for the audience?
Of course. Thanks, Sean. So just a reminder for those who don't know, John Rabe was a German. He was the head of the Siemens Corporation, the Electronics Corporation, who was stationed in Nanjing at the time that the Japanese invasion and massacre happened in late 1937. He organized the International Safety Zone, which tried to provide a kind of safe zone in the city where people who fled there would not be captured or attacked by the Japanese. It was only partially successful, but it was a very, very important element of the international community of that time, a very small one in Nanjing, showing their horror and disapproval at the savagery of the invasion and occupation of the city. This was doubly ironic, as many people pointed out, because John Rabe was himself actually a signed-up member of the Nazi Party. I think most people who've looked at his life would say that he had signed up in a sort of bureaucratic way rather than because of any ideological commitment to Nazism. But nonetheless, it is the fact that he was a member. But his actions in Nanjing at that time are remembered, including by the Chinese themselves, and you can go to his old house, which is open as a museum in Nanjing, as a righteous contribution, a contribution by a besieged foreign community to try and save Chinese lives at that particular time. So there's a small group of foreigners who essentially are still regarded as having done their very best both to record the facts of the massacre and also try and save some lives. There was John Rabe, Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary teacher at that time at Jinling College, a major sort of university college in Nanjing, who was very heavily traumatized and tragically took her own life a few years later. And a small range of others, Americans, Europeans, and others, who all came together to create this safety zone, which at least for a few weeks in a limited way managed to save some lives. And John Rabe, very much the leader and at the center of that. And after the war was over, he was recognized for his deeds and given some credit for that, and the fact that he had managed to at least make some sort of contribution to saving lives at a time of immense horror in the city.
No, thank you for that. So we're gonna. This is the rapid fire last question, just to get that in there. Could you briefly sketch what you see as the relationship between Chang and Stilwell? So I had to caveat that.
Okay, well I hope that Joe that's asking the question is not Joe Stilwell, or at least some kin possibly. It's an extraordinary story, and because we've got so little time, I'll just give it in a very capsule version. But you should read great books like Hans van der Ven's China at War to see how that story worked out. Essentially, Chiang Kai-shek had a strong belief that his American supply chief of staff, General Joe Stilwell, was essentially trying to refight endless battles against the Japanese using Chinese troops. He lost, in Chiang Kai-shek's eyes, Stilwell's reckless tactics lost Burma once in 42, and he was trying to fight it again in 44 at a time when China was on its uppers. Joe Stilwell in return thought that Chiang Kai-shek was overly cautious, that he was weak-minded, that he didn't really understand strategy, and that he had to be taken in hand, or else at one point he speculated assassinated if he wouldn't do what Stilwell wanted, which essentially was, whatever you think of it, not an appropriate position for the chief of staff of a national leader to take. So the two of them essentially had entirely different views of what the role of China was and what each of their roles were in terms of the overall strategy. The final note I'll give, though, is that in the wider sense of things, and Hans van der Ven, who I mentioned, actually makes this point, I think, very clearly in his work, there's an extent to which the relationship was great box office, great headlines, because they hated each other so much. But it wasn't necessarily the transformative factor, because in the end, China was regarded as, the last theater that we sorted out. Europe first, Pacific second, China after that. And to some extent, much of what, the Allied Central Command was doing was putting China into a kind of holding position. And neither Stilwell nor Chiang could actually do very much about that in the end.
So with that holding position, I'm going to say thank you to you and to Rob. What a fabulous session. And thanks to our viewers for amazing comments. Certainly we could have gone on with this, but we've got to move forward. Thanks to our sponsors of the Memory War Conference, the American Battle Monuments Commission, EA, Respawn Entertainment, and Oculus by Meta. And thanks to our presenters. Excellent panel.